You're on a beach vacation. You've got a drink in your hand, sunglasses on, and you're watching a sailboat head out toward the horizon. Slowly, it disappears, not all at once, but from the bottom up. The hull vanishes first, then the deck, then the mast, until only the very tip is visible, and then nothing. You don't think twice about it. You know exactly why that happens. The earth curves away beneath the boat. Now picture a monk, standing on a cliff somewhere in 11th century England, watching the exact same thing happen to the exact same kind of ship. He also knows exactly why it's happening. So if he already knew the earth was round, why does practically everyone alive today believe medieval people thought it was flat? Here's the story almost everyone grew up with. Medieval people thought the earth was flat. They imagined ships sailing off the edge into some kind of abyss. And then Christopher Columbus came along, brave and visionary, and sailed west to prove them all wrong, risking his life against superstition and ignorance to show the world the truth. It's a great story. It's also almost entirely made up. There is a kernel of truth buried in there, somewhere far beneath the surface. Some ancient cultures and some folk traditions really did picture a flat world, often resting on something, a giant turtle, cosmic pillars, that sort of imagery. That's real in certain contexts, in certain periods. But educated medieval Europe, the scholars, the universities, the church's own astronomers, they knew the earth was a sphere, not as some fringe theory whispered by a handful of geniuses, as settled, mainstream textbook knowledge, written down, taught, and repeated for 1,000 years. So let's take this apart, layer by layer. Here's the story almost everyone grew up with. The Greek inheritance. Sphericity was settled science, inherited whole. Here's where it starts, and it starts a long time before the Middle Ages even begin. By the 4th century BCE, Greek philosophers had already worked out that the earth was round, and not through guesswork. Aristotle pointed to the curved shadow the earth casts on the moon during a lunar eclipse. A flat disk would cast a straight-edged shadow. A sphere casts a curved one. He also noted that different stars are visible at different latitudes, something that only makes sense on a curved surface. This wasn't a fringe idea that got lost and rediscovered later. It was mainstream Greek science, and it got passed down essentially intact into the Roman world, and from there into medieval Christian scholarship. Medieval scholars weren't inventing astronomy from scratch. They were inheriting a fully formed spherical model of the earth and building on top of it. University curriculum. A spherical earth was required coursework. Here's the detail that should really surprise you. By the 13th century, European universities had a standard astronomy textbook that every student studying the subject was expected to learn. It was called the Tractatus de Sphera, literally, Treatise on the Sphere, written around 1230 by an English scholar named John of Sacrobosco. The title alone should tell you something. The book opens by explaining, plainly and directly, that the Earth is a sphere, and it lays out multiple proofs for why. This wasn't a controversial fringe text. It was the standard required introductory astronomy textbook at universities across Europe, Paris, Oxford, Bologna, for roughly 400 years. 400 years of European university students being taught as an opening, uncontroversial fact that the Earth is round. The ship and horizon proof. Medieval writers used it constantly. Remember that sailboat disappearing from the bottom up? Medieval writers used exactly that observation as one of their standard proofs of a spherical earth. It shows up again and again in medieval scientific and literary texts. A ship's hull vanishing before its mast, visible to anyone who spent time near open water, which, in a Europe full of trading ports and fishing towns, was a great many people. This is the same argument you'd make on that beach vacation. Medieval scholars weren't missing this observation. They were writing it down, teaching it, and using it as evidence, in exactly the way you'd expect a rational person looking at the same horizon to use it. Circumference math, Eratosthenes' calculation, known and reused for centuries. Here's where it gets genuinely impressive. Back in the 3rd century BCE, the Greek scholar Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth using nothing more than the angle of shadows cast in 2 different cities at the same time of day, and the known distance between them. His result came out remarkably close to the actual circumference of the Earth. This calculation didn't vanish into obscurity. Medieval scholars knew about it, discussed it, and used similar reasoning in their own astronomical writing. The debate in later centuries was never over whether Eratosthenes' method was valid. It was over exactly how large the Earth actually was, because getting the measurements precisely right with medieval instruments was genuinely hard. That distinction matters enormously because it sets up the very thing everyone gets wrong about Columbus. Columbus's real argument: the dispute was never about shape, only size. Here's the detail that quietly demolishes the entire popular myth. When Christopher Columbus proposed sailing west to reach Asia, the scholars who reviewed his plan, a Spanish royal commission convened at Salamanca, did not tell him the Earth was flat and that he'd sail off the edge. Every one of them agreed the Earth was a sphere. That was never in dispute. What they disputed was the size of that sphere, specifically how far it actually was from Europe to Asia sailing west. Columbus, working from a badly underestimated figure, believed the distance was small enough to be survivable. The Salamanca scholars, working from more accurate classical estimates, believed it was much farther, far enough that Columbus and his crew would starve to death before they ever reached land. They were right. Columbus was wrong. He got lucky, spectacularly lucky, that an entire continent he didn't know existed happened to be sitting in the way. The argument was never Earth is round versus Earth is flat. It was a math dispute about circumference, and the people who thought Columbus's numbers were wrong turned out to have the better argument. So, let's sit with this for a second, because it changes everything you thought you knew about this story. The flat Earth myth about medieval people isn't an old misunderstanding that's finally getting corrected. It's not something historians overlooked and eventually rediscovered. It was invented, deliberately, mostly in the 19th century. Writers in that era needed a story that made their own age look scientifically enlightened, and the easiest way to do that was to invent a darker, dumber past to compare themselves against. A flat Earth medieval Europe made a perfect villain, superstitious, backward, waiting for modern science to rescue it from ignorance. The myth isn't a misreading of medieval history. The myth is a piece of 19th century history. It tells you far more about the people who created it than about the people it claims to describe. Say that a different way. The flat Earth was never a medieval belief. It's a modern invention, dressed up in medieval clothing, so that a later century could feel superior by comparison. Let's put names and dates on all of this, because specificity is what makes a claim checkable. The Venerable Bede, an English monk writing around 725, discusses the spherical shape of the Earth directly in his work De Natura Rerum. Sacrobosco's Tractatus de Sphera from around 1230 was the standard astronomy textbook at European universities for roughly 4 centuries, and opens by establishing Earth's sphericity as basic fact. Even Dante, writing the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, a work of popular literature, not a scholarly treatise, builds his entire cosmic geography around a spherical Earth, complete with detailed geometric reasoning about hemispheres and antipodes. Now, the other side of the story, where the myth actually came from. Washington Irving, the American writer best known for Rip Van Winkle, published a biography of Columbus in 1828 that dramatized a confrontation between Columbus and flat Earth-believing clergy at Salamanca. It made for a great scene. It was fiction. There is no credible historical record of any such argument. The actual dispute, as we covered, was about distance, not shape. Later in the century, the American scientist John William Draper published a widely read book in 1874, arguing that science and religion had always been locked in fundamental conflict throughout history. A thesis that historians today largely reject as an oversimplification, but one that found the flat Earth myth extremely useful as supporting evidence. Between Irving's fiction and Draper's thesis, a myth with almost no basis in the actual medieval record became, within a few decades, common knowledge. Here's why this actually matters, beyond just correcting a fun fact. The flat Earth myth is a case study in how the past was dumb stories get made, not discovered through research, manufactured for a purpose by people who benefited from telling it. We do this constantly in every era, including our own. It's a deeply comforting narrative structure. The people before us were ignorant, and we are enlightened, and the distance between those two states is evidence of our own progress. It feels good, it's just often not true, or at least not nearly as true as the story implies. This is also, frankly, how a huge amount of misinformation works today. A dramatic, satisfying story, Columbus versus the Flat Earthers, spreads far faster and sticks far harder than the more accurate but less thrilling version, which is, a group of scholars had a technical disagreement about a circumference calculation. Nobody puts that on a t-shirt. The myth survives not because it's true, but because it's a better story. And that gap between what's true and what's tellable is exactly the gap that misinformation lives in, then and now.